There has yet to be another game that has checked the boxes for me on all of the different aspects that ESO does. I've had other games with portions I enjoyed more, but nothing as completely. But the thing I love most about ESO is the combat. It seems simple on the surface, but once you dive in and begin to realize how deep it really goes and all of the different directions you can take your character for different encounters, man, theory crafting is just something I really enjoy. And at this point, I've done a lot of it. And as someone who has put as much time into ESO as I have to say this is one of the most worrisome PTS cycles that I've seen in a long time. That isn't to say there isn't hope or that all of the changes in the patch notes were bad. I definitely want to highlight some of the good ones here as well, but there are a lot of issues with what they've proposed. I do hope we can work through this so that the changes better align with their stated goals and create a better ESO experience for both new and veteran players. Like I said, there are definitely some fun and interesting changes mixed in here. They have just been massively overshadowed by everything that is wrong with the patch. So this video will be my attempt at giving Zoss feedback over what the community and I have found so far. This one may end up a little longer than my usual feedback videos, but I spent pretty much all day, every day this past week putting this together, so it is what it is. Alright, the first thing I want to start with before we actually get into the new Update 35 changes is to revisit hybridization. I actually was on board with this from the start and have really enjoyed what it brings to the game. Unfortunately, the system is incomplete. They made these huge sweeping changes with hybridization, but before they finished cleaning up that system, they've moved on to a new complete overhaul with Update 35 that has its own set of issues to clean up. So to put it bluntly, the game's core combat systems feel like a giant mess right now. So, what still needs to be done with hybridization? First off, jewelry glyphs. Weapon and spell damage are separate here even though they are sourced together within the game. There actually aren't any ways to get only spell damage or only weapon damage added to your character aside from some percent boosts to those stats. So having them separate just creates this awkward situation where depending on your group composition or what potions you're using, you might have to swap back and forth pretty regularly with your glyphs. You might have one group that you have to run one set of glyphs and another group you run the other. I know people that actually just finally made an extra set of jewelry to not have to keep swapping their glyphs back and forth. At this point, it really just doesn't make any sense to have the two separate, and this was actually something they mentioned in the Update 33 combat preview, saying, in the long term, we plan on simply merging these bonuses so there are fewer names and effects you need to worry about, but there's a lot of behind the scenes work that will result from that, and as such, it may take quite some time before we're able to do that. Well, that was back in January that they said that, and as of now, we're looking at Update 36 at the earliest for this, which is likely not until around November. It just feels really bad to have all these loose ends that still need to be tied up, but instead we are moving on to another set of massive changes. So the next big pain point with hybridization is the potions. Pretty much the same issue here as with jewelry glyphs are skills that provide brutality and sorcery or savagery and prophecy. They combine those together, but potions still only give one or the other. Like we just read, they said they would be combined at some point, so I really think they just need to up the priority on this stuff. And then finally we have the class-specific minor passives. Minor savagery on Nightblades and minor prophecy on sorcerers. These essentially do the same thing, just a different route. One increases weapon crit, the other spell crit. And then we have minor brutality on DKs and minor sorcery on Templars, which also do the same thing, just a different route. One boosts weapon damage and one spell damage. I think what they need to do is just combine savagery and prophecy together and combine brutality and sorcery together, like they said, even for the minor versions. Now, yes, that would leave Dragonknights and Templars with the same exact buff and Nightblades and Sorcerers with the same buff. However, they could just make two new buffs for two of those four classes so that they aren't redundant, and then the four base game classes will be back to bringing their own unique buffs to the group. As it is right now, you really only need two of the four base game classes because you can just match your jewelry glyphs to the buffs provided and ignore the other stat, and this just doesn't feel great in my opinion. It's far from intuitive as well. So I think if you take care of those three things, the weapon and spell damage glyphs, the buffs on potions, and the class minor passes, hybridization would make a lot more sense as a whole and complete system throughout the game. It still might be a little confusing to returning players who are used to something completely different in the past, but for new players, it would be consistent across the board, and there wouldn't be these weird outliers that just don't make sense in today's game. And on top of that, having this unfinished business with the hybridization really worries me when I see them saying things in the Update 35 combat preview like, after these adjustments are live, we are going to focus on any resulting balance issues for the next few updates. Just no, we don't want to have to deal with incomplete and unfinished systems for almost a year. If it's not ready, ready, then no, don't release it in a state that has to be fixed over several updates. Stick it back in the oven, let it finish cooking, and then release it when it finally is ready. Alright, for the rest of this video, we'll be covering feedback specifically about the Update 35 changes. To start things off, I'm going to go over Code's forum post where he, as usual, gave thoughtful and articulate feedback that really has resonated with the player base. A lot of the points he makes align with what I was already going to mention, so I figured I'd read through his post and add my own feedback along the way. And frankly, he just said a lot of this better than I ever could. Also, quick shout out to Code for being only the 4th person ever to receive 5,000 insightful reactions on the forums. That's the little area at the bottom of each post where you can mark your reaction. So just goes to show that a lot of people have appreciated the insight that his posts have provided. But let's go ahead and get into it. I want to start off by saying that I have no qualms with the mission statement of these PTS changes. Specifically, the closer the gap between the low and high end, the easier it is to create content that can accommodate a wider audience. We hope to reduce the stress of many combat rotations, allowing for you to focus more on the action in front of you rather than the action of juggling buffs and debuffs on your ability bar and making the game far more accessible. I agree that there is a very large power gap, that this power gap is one that has grown over the years, and that such a large power gap isn't particularly healthy. But I don't think that the changes in Update 35 are the correct way to address these problems, and yes, that has been the general sentiment in the community, it seems. My post will be in 3 parts, where I talk about the light attacks and weaving, about effect durations, and about the power gap problem in general. Part 1, light attacks, heavy attacks, and weaving. This is probably the least controversial change. I agree with that. Reducing light attack damage would reduce the power gap between those who can and can't weave, but there are 3 issues with this change. It also impacts some of the people who are ostensibly part of the target audience for this change. The proverbial floor, people who just spam light attacks, will be even less effective after this change. The nerf to heavy attacks seems completely counterproductive, especially since heavy attack builds have been a popular accessibility option for years, and this change reduces everyone's damage. Yes, it will reduce the damage of someone who weaves perfectly a bit more than someone who misses light attacks, but it's still a nerf for the latter. And as mentioned, those people who just use light and heavy attacks. And yeah, that last part's really the kicker. Everyone's damage is going down regardless of weaving skill. So let's read on here. For the people who are your target audience, how do you justify to them that their combat effectiveness is going down? It's one thing to say to someone parsing 130k on live that a reduction to their damage was for the health of the game, but it's quite another to say to someone who's using an accessible heavy attack build that their playstyle is getting hit for their own good. So while we are on light and heavy attacks, one thing that I've found after testing this week is that with the nerfs to the base damage, there's now an increased importance of relying on Empower and the Maelstrom staff, which both buff your light attacks. After these buffs are added in, light attacks are back to around the range that they were before, which makes great light attack weaving just as essential as before and completely contradicting the stated goal. Since dot damage is also down, this creates a situation where light attacks can still stand out quite a bit in your overall damage. So really, this change coupled with ways to boost your light attack damage back up doesn't do anything to help the skill gap. In fact, it might even make it larger because you now need to have good light attack weaving with a Maelstrom staff, and you need good Empower uptime or your damage will really suffer a lot. Empower is kind of ridiculous in comparison to our base light and heavy attack damage, more valuable than most dots because light attacks can still hit once every second rather than the new dot standard of every 2 seconds, but we'll get into the dots later. So overall, not the end of the world if light attack damage comes down depending on what goes on around it, but this route that they have taken does not seem to be the right way to go. I think Empower should either do a completely different buff altogether or add in no more than a third of what our base light attacks do, rather than the 80% or so that it is right now. But we'll move on to the next part. We'll talk about duration changes. Code says, I remember the days when Wall of Elements lasted just 6 seconds. In 2019, this was increased to 10 seconds. I and most people believe that the duration increase in 2019 was the right move. It made the skill easier to manage, and on the whole, things felt better as a result of this duration change. So here we are 3 years later looking at another duration increase. This time, I'm not on board with these changes. Why not? For short durations, the main problem is that they require a lot of micromanagement. You need to pay attention to that wall and recast it every 6 seconds, and people will often forget and lose potential damage. For long durations, the problem is that you are more severely penalized for an early recast. Recasting a 20-second wall at or before the 10-second mark is a loss. You'd be better off using a spammable instead. You don't get the full benefit of wall being twice the power of a spammable unless you let that single cast of wall go for the full 20 seconds. Which brings us to a key problem. I feel like the duration change makes no sense outside of the sterile environment of target dummy testing. Dungeons and Trials. Finn said in an interview that they're actively looking to make sure that fights incorporate movement. The first boss of Graven Deep, for example, is constantly dashing around the room, and there are fights where there are specific burst windows in which to hit the boss. Olms in Archcustodian, for example. For Dungeons and Trials, around 12 seconds was a sweet spot. You could usually get most of a 12-second ground dot in a mobile fight, and 12-second lines up well with burst windows like Olms and Archcustodian. 20-second dots that do less than a spammable until after the 10-second mark are just not worth using in many fights. So completely agree with what he's saying here, and that also doesn't even mention that some of the dots they've made are now 30 seconds as well. Overland. Do overland fights last long enough for 20-second dots to make sense? The existing 10-second dots are already way too long for the vast majority of open world encounters, with world bosses being the most notable among the few exceptions. PvP, ground dots are already mostly useless in PvP because people will just sidestep them. The lower damage per second will make ground dots even less effective at applying pressure and make them even less effective at denying areas. And when fighting classes with accessible class purges like Templars and Wardens, 20-second sticky dots make no sense to use, since it's very likely they will be removed before they could do more damage than just a spammable skill. So in short, buffing durations from 6 seconds to 10 seconds did help with the goal of making effects easier to manage, but there is a limit to how much further increases can help, and in a large number of real-world scenarios, 20-second durations just make no sense. This change is simply incompatible with what combat is like in reality outside of an artificial target dummy testing environment. Aside, I think for self-buffs like Crit Surge, long durations are fine, but most of those self-buffs already have long durations. And yeah, I agree with that too. I think it's really the dot lengths that are mostly in question here, not the buff lengths. So what can we do instead? If the goal is to make timer watching easier, then consistent timers are more important than long timers. For example, on live, Stampede leaves behind a 15-second AoE, while Twisting Path leaves behind a 12-second AoE. Disparate timers means that I need to watch both timers separately, whereas if they had the same timer, I could say to myself, every time I refresh my path, I should refresh my Stampede too. A timer consistency pass to synchronized durations would have helped tremendously with the timer watching problem without the myriad of problems with the current long duration approach. But instead of timer consistency, we just got long timers. As Nephis demonstrated in his PTS DK parse video, the rotation is still complicated because the timers are all over the place. Some abilities are shorter than 20 seconds, some are longer, and so he still needs to watch a bank of timers. This isn't really much easier, and in real combat situations, you need to also constantly ask yourself, should I be refreshing my eruption now, or will the boss be moving away too soon? So I agree with most of this. Personally, I do enjoy the differing timer lengths because I think it makes things a little more interesting, but I definitely get where he's coming from, and for Zos's stated goals, this makes sense. With the proposed changes on many build loadouts, players will still find themselves with lots of different timers to keep up. They just won't have to make those decisions quite as often. As for the overall feel of it, it can be a bit boring for more experienced players, especially on classes like Dragonknight who have even longer dots than normal, with most at 24 seconds or longer. You find yourself spending most of your time just standing there whipping, which I'll admit is a matter of preference. I think some people will like the feel of that change, but many veterans who've gotten down the nuances of the fast-paced combat will not. But let's say you do like the feel of the longer dots. The damage from them is still way down, and therefore even a better performed rotation due to easier use will still be a DPS loss for you, which is definitely a big part of why I'm so against these changes. They actually don't raise up the floor at all. I saw a really cool idea to create a third morph of skills that does what they're proposing, longer dots that deal a bit more per cast but less per second. So if people want to go that route with the skill, they can, can, but they're not forced into it. I'm sure that would be a bit more difficult to implement, but it seemed like a nice compromise to accommodate different types of players. But let's go ahead and move on. Furthermore, not everything was buffed. I mostly play as a tank, and Clinch applies a 15-second taunt, a 5-second major maim, and a 4-second minor brittle. That's 3 different timers on one ability, and neither the 5-second maim or the 4-second brittle were buffed at all by the long duration changes. And an even more forgettable 30-second blockade means nothing to me when I still need to refresh Clinch every few seconds to keep maim and brittle up. Next, a lot of buffs come from sets. One good example is Powerful Assault, which lasts for 10 seconds. The skill most often used by a tank or healer to proc Powerful Assault is Echoing Vigor, which also happens to last for 10 seconds. On live, all I need to do is keep Echoing Vigor up, and I know that I'm also refreshing Powerful Assault when it's needed. But on PTS, with the longer duration, now the timers don't match, and I'd often forget to refresh the Powerful Assault buff. So instead of making things easier, this change actually made things harder and worse. Frankly, it looks like very little thought was put into this. Yeah, these are big ones too, and I think good examples of what actually creates the real power gap in ESO. It isn't the dot durations or light attack damage. Yeah, those may play a small part in it, but a well-organized group keeping up a slew of hard-to-manage buffs at ridiculous uptimes from skills mentioned like Clinch. The Major Force from Warhorn is another that has a massive discrepancy in uptimes between elite and even strong veteran groups. But also these item set buffs and the coordination that's required with those as well. Powerful Assault is already tricky because it only goes to 5 other group members, and it's only a 10-meter radius, so you already have to double cast to hit everyone. This kind of coordination for the crazy amounts of buffs and debuffs we have access to is exciting for the groups that can do it, but just way too demanding for 99.9% of the player base to handle, while also conquering the mechanics of the dungeon or trial that are in front of them, thus creating a massive power gap. Don't get me wrong, I'm definitely not saying that it should be super easy to keep every single buff and debuff up 100%, but I definitely think this is an area that should be looked at more closely. But we'll continue on. Finally, there has been much said already by others about the tick every 2-second change, from worries about how heals will line up with incoming damage and difficult content that often tick more than once per second, and he gives an example of how many damage ticks a tank could take in 1.4 seconds, and also concerns about how this will affect set and enchantment procs. So yeah, this dot frequency for ground dots is actually one of my least favorite changes out of everything going on here. It seems like not a huge deal on the surface, but let's walk through it. So first off, just from an immersion standpoint, ground dots are meant to be these areas of persistent damage. Whether there's fire on the ground or raining arrows, visually, these are areas where the user perceives this as an area that within it has a constant effect. Having them only tick every 2 seconds makes them feel more like a spike trap in a dungeon where you have to wait for it to trigger and then quickly run by to avoid the danger. Ideally, I feel like these abilities should tick every half second to further push the persistent area of effect idea, but I do think 1 second is an okay compromise and middle ground and probably helps with server performance. 2 seconds really feels awful though, especially with how much lower the ticks are now. Think of PvP 2 stacking entry points with dots was a way to keep people out, but if they only tick every 2 seconds, I'd imagine it would be much easier to just run through and avoid most of the ticks of damage as you pass by. Not to mention that most of these ticks that do hit deal less damage now too. This just doesn't make sense. It doesn't feel good. And this is just from a how does this feel perspective. There are also lots of technical issues that code alluded to as well. Aside from heals not matching up with damage rates from enemy encounters, the dot damage does not line up with our current enchantment system. To go with popular PvE examples, our infused Crusher enchantment and our infused weapon damage glyphs last 5 seconds with a 5-second cooldown. With the old 1-second intervals of dots, this was no issue to keep up with your ground dot of choice. However, now that it only ticks every 2 seconds, essentially you have to always have 1 second of downtime every 6 seconds. This is actually an issue that Dual Wield on the back bar already ran into a few patches back when they decided to change Deadly Cloak to only tick every 2 seconds, and you saw a drastic decrease in the usage of Dual Wield as a back bar option. Well, that was never fixed, and now all weapons will have to deal with that. It just doesn't feel good and doesn't work with the way that they've designed the game, but it actually doesn't stop there. Let's say we gave up on the weapon damage enchantment and went with the fire glyph instead, since that can proc every 2 seconds and our ground dots tick every 2 seconds. Well, with the way that the game handles tick frequencies, they actually aren't always exactly every 2 seconds. Sometimes they are a few milliseconds longer than that, sometimes a few milliseconds shorter than that. So as Wrath described in his post here, even with those glyphs, you'll often not keep up the enchantment on cooldown, where in theory you should be able to based on the tick frequency. This has actually always been a thing, but just much less noticeable because if you only missed 1 second, it's going to make a lot less difference than now if you miss 2 seconds. So I really hope they rethink the dot frequency changes. I know it's probably better on the servers, but there are a lot of issues that come along with them, and they don't feel nearly as good as the old 1 second tick rates. If ZOS refuses to change them back to 1 second, at least fix the enchantments so that they will work properly. I'm not focusing on the healing changes in this video, but just to quickly point out, for the healing, this is going to make the game much less accessible for groups that are attempting harder content for the first time, which goes directly against their stated goals. And then the final section of Code's post here, and in my opinion, the most important one, Part 3, Power Creep and Content Creep in PvE. The two problems that I see right now in ESO's PvE endgame are there is a large power gap, and new veteran hard mode content is balanced around what is possible at the top end. First, I want to give people some idea of what I mean when I say large power gap. For example, my weekend group got another Dawnbringer, Kind's Aegis Trifecta, a few months ago. Our group has Godslayer, and this was our second Dawnbringer, so you can probably say that we're part of that elitist 0.1%. Anyway, for that Dawnbringer run, we killed the second boss in 1 minute and 46 seconds. Recently, a group on EU set a new world record for Kind's Aegis, and their second boss kill time was 58 seconds. It was almost twice as fast. So there is a pretty wide power delta even between the 0.1% like us and the competitive 0.01% like them. And this is not even considering the power gap between us and groups that are just able to clear Kind's Aegis hard mode, and then the power gap between those kinds of groups and people who don't even participate in vet hard mode content, and then finally the power gap between those who just do vet non-hard mode and people who don't even participate in vet content. And this power gap is growing. I've been participating in vet trials since 2016. I've never seen the power gap as high as it is today. So like I said, I think this is a very important topic to bring up, maybe the most important out of all of this discussion. And I've definitely noticed this too. The gap between even very strong veteran teams and those that are considered to be at the very top has been widening for a while now. For example, when Sunspire came out, veteran raid teams that I was a part of were able to conquer the hard modes in the first patch that they arrived. Same with Kind's Aegis, and that was actually my first trial that I got the trifecta in the release patch. However, Rockgrove came out and it was almost 6 months before we could even clear the hard mode with the trifecta achievement just simply feeling out of reach. We didn't get worse as a raid team, the content just got a lot harder to accommodate that rising top end, while our power creep was not rising at the same rate. And as a team full of veteran players, but not necessarily ones that get super sweaty spending hours every day raiding, this just feels so demotivating to see the ceiling and content keep rising higher and higher above us. We know we're solid players, but most of us simply don't have the time it takes to pour into this level of difficulty to conquer it. Now, I'm not saying it should be Craglorn level for all trials or anything like that, but designing content difficulty around a few hundred people when that small group is improving at a rate much faster than your standard player, this just doesn't seem good for the overall health of the game. I've been saying it for a while, but I'd love if they could bring that top end difficulty down just a notch to be a bit more accessible, not by everyone, but at least by their veteran raiding community, and then give proper incentives for those top few hundred players that are going to be able to make it onto the patch leaderboards and really push content at that next level. I think this would be a much healthier place overall, as many teams are finding themselves in a place with the newer content where a veteran is just not challenging enough, but vet hard mode can look insurmountable. It isn't the easiest problem in the world to fix, I know there are a ton of moving pieces, but I guess the point overall is that based on everything that is listed in the patch notes for week 1 of this PTS, none of these issues are addressed and are actually made worse by the massive damage and healing per second loss that we're all facing. All right, let's go ahead and move on with his post. I think he mentions a lot of what I just said here, so I probably jumped the gun a bit. So there's a large and growing power gap, but by itself, a large power gap isn't a huge problem, except that in ESO, the Trials team seems to be targeting those 0.01% of people at the very top when they balance the new hard modes. Looking at Rockgrove's hard mode, for example, the group DPS required to clear Oak's hard mode cleanly, and the DPS required to beat the DPS check on Zalvaka hard mode is higher than the DPS required for Godslayer, which is a trifecta achievement. So yeah, kind of what I was just saying, the content is rising much faster than the majority of the player base. The end result of this large and growing power gap is that the 2 most recent trial hard modes are less accessible than the 4 most recent trial hard modes that preceded them, and I'd say the hard modes are even harder than the trifectas for the previous 4 trials. He goes on to say, I actually don't have a Rockgrove hard mode clear because my group got frustrated with how it was so overtuned and voted to leave the trial. This is why there are so many players who will cry bloody murder at even the faintest whispers of a power nerf for them. For the vast majority of players, the stuff at the top end is already out of reach, and you are now telling them that for their own good, they'll lose power. It should be no surprise to anyone that this will elicit hostility from many players. Also, power creep isn't necessarily a bad thing, as it means that people who can't tackle the latest hard modes might have a chance to do so in the future. This is especially true since new content balance takes this power creep into account. People have come to expect power creep each patch to help bring inaccessible content closer within reach, and telling everyone that you intend to roll back power creep is, controversial to put it lightly. Conversely, balancing for the top end is okay when there isn't a huge power gap. If the difference between what we can do and what a world record group could do is only 10 to 20%, then it's fine for trials to be balanced around. If there's a group that could pull it off, then it's fine. But when the gap is as large as it is today, that just means far too many players are excluded. It's the combination of a large power gap and balancing for the top that is causing problems. And as someone has already pointed out in their PTS feedback, not everyone sees this power creep. Seemingly every patch, new things are added that are not universally accessible. New buffs to keep up, like Minor Brittle, new sets to juggle around and maintain uptimes for new kiss curse mechanisms, offering power to players skilled enough to deal with the curse, etc. All of these things provide opportunities for players and groups with the wherewithal to efficiently take advantage of new sources of power, while most players will not see their benefits. This is why when I recently joined a number of vet trials pugged out of Craglorn, I still saw 8-minute Yolnahkrin non-hard mode kills that don't seem any faster than what I saw in pug runs a couple of years ago, while at the top end, Yolnahkrin kill times have gone down with each new world record that gets set. I mean, I don't even know what to say here, really. He's just saying everything I want to say, so I'll just keep reading through. The power creep that we see is predominantly power creep at the top because it's power that requires skill and group coordination to extract, and this is why we have an ever-increasing power gap. But none of the changes being proposed in Update 35 targets any of this. Hard to maintain effects are unchanged, Minor Brittle is still 4 seconds, buffs and effects from sets like Powerful Assault are unchanged, so that the gap between groups that are able to efficiently maintain that effect and most other groups is untouched. It doesn't change that there is an ever-growing number of supportive item sets that well-coordinated groups are able to work into their composition, while more casual groups will just not have them. Take for example, besides Mania, it grants the player power if their magicka is low. Skilled players will start by dumping their magicka and will have calibrated their sustain so that their magicka levels remain low without running out. They're able to extract a lot more power out of this item set than the average player, thus contributing to the growing power gap. And then the power gap that was expanded upon by this and many other new sets or new combat mechanics such as Brittle are compensated with by disruptive changes in long-standing combat mechanics, resulting in nerfs for players who had never taken advantage of this new power in the first place. This is why these changes are frustrating for so many players. But at the end of the day, I'm perfectly okay with there being a large power gap and power creep as long as content isn't balanced for what the top end is capable of doing. This statement right here, I can't stress it enough. I'm perfectly okay with there being a large power gap and power creep as long as content isn't balanced for what the top end is capable of doing. Let them have their portal skip Cloud Rest. The trial is still hard for the vast majority of groups even today. But that's fine because Cloud Rest and the achievements in Cloud Rest were never tuned for those kinds of tippity top groups, to borrow phrasing from Rich. It's when you have things like DPS checks in Rockgrove hard mode and insane speedrun time requirements in Dreadsail hard mode that are clearly aimed at those tippity top groups that the power gap becomes a major problem in PvE. Let score competition be the open-ended outlet for those groups at the apex of the game and buff up leaderboard rewards for them, but stop balancing achievements and even just hard mode clears around that level of play. You'll have a much healthier rating scene where more more things are accessible to a greater range of player power. And perhaps then people will not be as likely to react with such strident hostility to the prospect of any power being ripped away from them. So Code and I are pretty much sharing a brain on this one. If you don't listen to anything else in this video, please just listen to that last paragraph. This is a big thing. This is a video game. For many of us, it's our escape and a fun hobby we like to hop on, hang out with friends, conquer challenges together. And sometimes it feels like a battle with the developers to just let us enjoy the game and have fun. I don't know why it feels like ZOS is so often against their players and trying to rein them in. It doesn't have to be so serious, especially on the PvE side. Let people grow more powerful. Or fine, rein it in, but the content at the high end is simply too hard for too many people if you want to go that route. Of course, strive for balance, but we don't have to be so cookie cutter with everything either. Biggest point, let us have fun. Don't make us dread upcoming patches. We shouldn't be at the end of a current patch praying that we finish whatever we're working on because the next patch is going to kill our damage and healing. So thank you, Code, for this really well-written post, and I do hope the Encounter team and the Balance team are listening and can work together a little more to make this a more fun and accessible game for a wide range of people, because I'll be honest, the current list of changes feel more like punishment than anything else. Alright, so now that we are through with that, I'm going to go through some other stuff that I've found over the week, digging through all of the changes. I went through every class and every damaging skill just to try and wrap my head around what is going on with all of this rebalancing. I'm sorry, healers, I know there are a lot of issues on that side of things too. Just isn't my area of expertise, so I'm kind of sticking with what I know for now. But please listen to our healers too. These changes are having a huge impact there. But I'll have this spreadsheet linked in the description as well if anyone wants to dig through it. So let's start with the class changes. I won't get into the dot links specifically since we already talked about that earlier, but instead we'll talk about the other class balance stuff that would be going into effect even if they decided to go back on the really long timers. For Dragonknights, I know a lot of people have been memeing this change. Molten Whip now costs half magicka and half stamina. I think if it weren't for the history here, the player base has been asking for a stamina-based Poison Whip for years now. So that history aside, I actually really like this change. It's unique, it's the only skill to have a hybrid cost like this, and it makes using it a lot more accessible for stamina-based Dragonknights. No, it isn't a Poison Whip, but in my opinion, it's still a good change overall. It just might not meet the expectations of what some people have been wanting. And to go along with the cost changes, Talons and Deep Breath also got cost reductions. I think this was a great move to get these into the DK kit a little more often. They're really great abilities, but been held back from using them a lot by the difficulty in sustaining them. So overall, crazy long dots aside, I think DKs were one of the least affected classes and still retain much of the same feel as they did before. Next, we'll talk about Necromancers. I really liked their Rapid Rot passive coming down to a more reasonable 10% and some more power put back into their Execute passive. Seems like a lot more interesting design for them overall rather than having ridiculously overpowered dots be their main thing. It's just something more fun to play around and watch your damage start to soar during Execute. Like DKs, I think they actually got their class skills balanced pretty well here. The Skeletal Mage feels rather weak as a morph option, but most of their skills are very much worth using. And the split from the better ones to use to the worst ones seems a bit more narrow than on some other classes. Out of all the changes going through, I think the biggest thing that hurts Necros is losing their Spirit Guardian. It pretty much gets one shot in PvE and definitely isn't worth the cast. If it's only going to absorb a very limited amount of damage before it dies, I think the mitigation offers should be a bit higher to compensate, or just change the threshold to a higher amount before it dies. 30k damage in PvE is pretty much nothing, especially for a tank using it. I would still like to see them do something with the Colossus, since Major Vuln is so readily available now from other sources, maybe a massive cost reduction, or even having one morph that actually leaves behind a strong AoE to give Necros an actual damage ultimate. That would be pretty sick. And then the Blighted Blastbones morph needs something for PvE to make it stand out a bit more. It just pales in comparison in every way to stalking Blastbones. But overall, Necros fared pretty well with update 35. Next up are Nightblades. The aspect of terror change is really cool. Major Cowardice reduces the target's weapon and spell damage by 430, so this adds some new unique group utility for Nightblades to bring. Previously only item sets would offer this debuff, but now you could have a Nightblade support to really help rein in some of the incoming damage from encounters. I love to see this kind of thing for different classes to bring something to the table that other classes can't easily offer. It also fits really well with the Nightblade kit since they can also provide minor cowardice. Another change I actually ended up really liking is the surprise attack 100% crit chance from flank. Initially, I read it to be way too overpowered, and while it is strong, don't get me wrong, our builds are generally pretty high in crit chance already in PvE, and surprise attack was definitely previously underperforming compared to other class spammables, so this one actually feels pretty good now. Killer's Blade is not necessarily a bad change, but the skill functions exactly like Executioner now, so that one has me scratching my head a little. The only difference is you get a heal if the enemy dies within 2 seconds of using it, but the tooltip and the scaling are identical, so I don't know why you would use Executioner now. This one's whatever, it's not the end of the world, but I would like to see Killer's Blade stand out more as its own thing rather than a copy-paste from a skill that already exists. So let's talk about Twisting Path. It is now one of the weakest dots that a Nightblade can use, whereas on the live servers, it is their strongest. I'm not sure why they felt like they needed to tear this one down so far. It's one of the staples of the Nightblade kit, and it's no longer even worth it as there are just way too many better options. On the flip side, Debilitate is actually one of the best dots now when it was kind of a middle of the pack dot previously. And this seems to be because the damage from the overcharged ticks is unchanged, and that accounts for quite a bit of extra damage with this skill. Funnily enough, Ambush is actually one of their strongest options, assuming you don't have Empower going already. So we talked about Empower earlier being really strong. 10 seconds of Empower plus a rather weak upfront hit from a gap closer is worth well more than most of the dots that you could use. It just doesn't seem like it should be this way to me. Ambush shouldn't be stronger than Stampede, especially since it gives you buffs and debuffs as well. Just really awkward to me. But other than those few things, Nightblade does feel pretty decent overall. I think if you can get a handle on the light attacks and Empower so that a skill like Ambush isn't your go-to, and then Twisting Path can be given some love, I think I could live with most of the other stuff. Next up is Sorcerer. Man, when I initially went through these patch notes, I kind of had a meltdown in this section. Just so many nerfs, like almost every skill that they could use for PvE DPS got nerfed. But I'll be honest, most of it is not as bad as it initially looked. Some of the other stuff though, we'll get there. The 2 DPS pets being nerfed is kind of whatever, it's not really a huge deal. Both the Scamp and the Bird still deal really good damage. The Atro ultimate nerf hurt quite a bit though. Per ultimate cast, the Greater Storm Atro only does about 65% of what it did before. The group utility buff on it is actually pretty nice though. 6 people getting Major Berserk instead of 1 is not bad at all. I noticed when we did a raid on the PTS, we were getting like 20 to 30% uptime on Major Berserk from having some Atros going. So I definitely think for group play, it's probably still their best option for an ultimate. The AoE morph is actually pretty close behind in damage now as well. The gap shrunk a lot between the 2 morphs. So I do wonder if that morph could finally sneak its way in for certain group play scenarios as well. For selfish DPS though, the Atro does seem kind of in line with Meteor from the Mages Guild line, and Overload actually seems to possibly deal slightly more damage per ulti point spent than the Atro does. I did a handful of Stamsork parses, and though the results look pretty close here, I did get some crazy good luck on the Atro ultimate for that parse, whereas my Overload crits were just kind of meh. Overload definitely felt like more consistently high damage to me, but I only had time for about a couple of hours of testing with this. Personally, I'm not really against the idea of using Overload more, but currently there's something going on with it. It's really buggy and it's really hard to weave. I kept missing so many light attacks with it, even though I was just weaving like I normally do. When I didn't have it slotted, my light attacks were landing just fine. There's also an issue if you want to use it with another ult. Like I tried opening up with Overload and then dropping my Atro once I got down to just enough ult to cast the Atro. Well, it would deplete my ultimate like normal for casting the Atro, but it would not toggle off my Overload. So instead of shutting it off and my ult starting to regen again like normal, I just stood there and could only cast abilities. I couldn't light attack at all. And of course, I wasn't generating ultimate either because it was still toggled on. So my character would just stand there, not being able to overload light attack and not being able to regular light attack. So you'd have to swap back and make sure you toggle it off, even though it would normally toggle off on its own if you didn't have any ult left. So yeah, definitely kind of buggy. I think I'd actually enjoy the thought of using Overload a little bit more if it wasn't so jank right now. Next up, Crystal Weapon got nuked. This one definitely needed a nerf for sure, and I initially thought the tooltip looked okay for their changes, but when comparing it to the tooltips for other spammables, I actually noticed that the 2 components of Crystal Weapon added together was still lower than 1 cast of Wrecking Blow or Rapid Strikes. So it just doesn't feel like there's much reason to run Crystal Weapon at all. Just makes for a more difficult rotation that is less forgiving of missed light attacks without enough payoff. I think it needs to be somewhere maybe in the 140 to 150% of a baseline range spammable for it still to be exciting to use. Bound Aegis got some nice buffs, but I'm at a loss with Bound Armaments. These heavy nerfs make no sense to me. Sure, it could have been adjusted down some, but taking away both the light attack increase and the damage from the proc, it now only deals the damage of a regular spammable and actually even less damage than some of the stronger spammables like Wrecking Blow or Rapid Strikes. So why would I want to slot this and take away bar space, have to activate it every 40 seconds when it hits for less than my regular spammable would? I don't know, this one feels really bad. I think they need to go back to the drawing board for the design or the numbers on this one. Comparing Daedric Prey to Haunting Curse, with the pets both being nerfed and the Atro ultimate nerf, I was actually getting a lot less damage even with 2 pets in an Atro using Daedric Prey than I was with Haunting Curse. So I think maybe with Daedric Prey, they need to revisit that pet boost. It seemed okay before at 20% when pets and the Atro were insanely strong, but now that those are toned down, I think it could probably jump back up a bit. Hurricane and Boundless Storm still feel pretty good. Definitely solid abilities to run, with Hurricane being your go-to generally for PvE DPS. Overall, some strange changes for Sorcerer. Definitely felt awkward to put together a DPS setup for my Stamsorc, and while it wasn't awful by any means, I think they are in need of a lot of tweaks to feel like all of their skills are useful still. Some of these adjustments just landed in really weird spots. On to Templars. Yes, jabs got toned down a bit, and Burning Light proccing from any ability but doing less damage. They're both nerfs overall to both of those things, but to me it feels more balanced overall and healthier for the class design. It's very nice for versatility, especially in enabling range setups to not feel like they've lost all of their damage from not using jabs. Although they may need to revisit Blazing Spear and Radial Sweep in its morphs, as Burning Light was a big part of their power. This also allows for Beam to start being used a little earlier, which feels nice. Previously, it wasn't worth casting until like 18% or later into the fight, but now that seems to fall back into a normal execute range of about 25% in most builds. Vampire Bane finally seems to be worth slotting if you need major savagery or prophecy. Before, it was definitely more worth it to just double bar Inner Light or Camo Hunter. It's still probably pretty close, and short fights, those would definitely still be the better option. But for longer fights, Vamp Bane can actually be pretty good. It's ridiculously long at 32 seconds. That extra 2 seconds does feel kind of awkward though. I feel like these class passives that rework skill links should just be scrapped. Make the skills last whatever you want them to last balance wise, and then use those passives for more fun and exciting alterations to gameplay. But overall, Templars did pretty well with the changes. They're still looking pretty good. It's mostly Sorcerers that took a lot of hits, as well as Wardens, who we'll talk about now. Cutting Dive went from one of the strongest spammables in the game to one of the worst. Maybe it might be the worst. The cost refund during off balance is not that necessary and would be nice if it instead had a separate function that enabled more damage. I think the Magicamorph actually looks pretty decent here and could see some use. But for stamina, Rapid Strikes seems to be the clear winner over Cutting Dive now. The shocks were also adjusted. The Stamina Morph now pops at 3 seconds and 8 seconds, whereas the Magicamorph pops at 4 seconds and 10 seconds. So comparing the tooltips, the Magicamorph actually hits a little bit harder because of that Piercing Cold passive that increases magic damage by 10%, but getting that damage a little quicker does seem to be a slight DPS increase for the Sub-Assault Morph. But they are pretty close together now, and if you think you might even get a slight benefit from the Major and Minor Breach that the Magicamorph gets, definitely go that route. Otherwise, for scenarios with perfect uptimes on both of those debuffs, Sub-Assault should squeak out barely ahead. Personally, I think the Stamina Morph should still pop at 3 and 6. It doesn't have any of the utility that the Magicamorph has, yet it's only very slightly ahead in damage, and it's even behind in damage per hit, just slightly ahead in actual damage per second. So overall, I don't think the changes are awful with these. I know some people have complained about their longer cadence between using, and I definitely understand not liking them from that aspect, but they are both very strong skills right now. The Bear ultimate got some adjustments as well. Definitely seems to do a little less passive damage, but should still account for quite a bit of your overall DPS. They did nerf the bleed morph a little to not have guaranteed hemorrhaging, but instead just have a really high chance of it. I think that's fine. You'll probably still have very good uptimes on your bleeds as a Warden. The other morph though, this increases execute damage. I don't know how I feel about this one. Both morphs are just more damage, but in a different way. I haven't done the math on them yet, but I assume that one will just come out stronger for damage than the other, and that's the morph that we'll go with. I think I would have rather seen the Magicka morph offer more of a utility type buff or a group-wide buff. I think that would have created a more interesting choice between the two morphs here. Moving on to Arctic Blast. This one is a cool idea for a dot that follows you around similar to Deadly Cloak, but the damage on it is awful, way down at the bottom there. It does less damage per cast than one spammable, so it really isn't worth slotting unless you are just using it for that heal. I think they had a nice opportunity here to give the Wardens another ice skill to use for DPS, but this one missed the mark. Speaking of ice skills, Winter's Revenge also feels pretty weak now. It's not nearly as bad as Arctic Blast, but it did suffer similar treatment that Twisting Path got. Necro's Boneyard skill deals way more damage than Winter's Revenge does, even though Wardens are the class with the ice skill line. I would really like to see this one increased back to being a standout dot like they had it before. The change to the Advanced Species passive will definitely hurt for organized group play, as the percent damage done boosts were more valuable, but the pin is probably a little better for solo as well as PvP. And honestly, if the class would get some other tweaks to it, losing this wouldn't be a huge deal. Definitely hurts, but they could compensate in other areas. Overall, Wardens took a pretty massive hit for PvE DPS, especially Stamina Wardens. Looks like they definitely need a little love going forward. Alright, now let's go through some of the non-class skills. Stampede is one of the ones that left me the most confused. They previously buffed it really high to get more engagement out of it, and it made sense because it was much more risky to use Stampede as your backbar ground dot, where you have to actually launch yourself into the thick of combat, as opposed to something like Wall of Elements or Endless Hail, where you can safely stand back and place it without getting in harm's way. Not to mention the size on Stampede is very small compared to Wall of Elements. So not only does Wall do more damage than Stampede, but it is safer and it covers more area. And that isn't even mentioning Wall being boosted by special flame buffs, whereas Stampede is what it is. And the Maelstrom Staff also being stronger as an arena weapon than the Maelstrom two-hander plays a factor as well. And they nerfed the Maelstrom two-hander, which I'm just a bit baffled by that. Overall, I don't get this one. There's actually zero reason now to use Stampede as your backbar dot for DPS. It's worse than Wall or Volley in every way. Moving on, I do like the little buff they gave to Poison Injection. This one doesn't see a lot of PvE usage nowadays. It usually doesn't start doing enough damage to be worth a cast until way later into the fight. I still think they could give it a little more juice though. Maybe start the execute scaling at 100% health instead of 50% and adjust the values accordingly, so it would be worth using a bit earlier. But still glad to see this one get a buff regardless. Most of the other weapon line dots feel pretty good still. It was mainly just Stampede I don't know what they did with that. Rending Slashes got some nice buffs, and Deadly Cloak still feels solid to use as well. Even Quick Cloak actually seems decent. It's not as good as Deadly Cloak, but the gap is smaller than it used to be, and a 30-second dot for it would be super easy to keep up. For our minor force skills, Barbed Trap is kind of cracked now with the 10 times chance to proc hemorrhaging, gets those bleed up times around what we're used to seeing from Poisoned and Burning. And then the other morph is actually not that bad now if you need to be ranged, because it finally has the same length. They're both 20 seconds. It just doesn't get that extra chance to proc hemorrhaging, but could be a solid option for ranged builds. Channeled Acceleration and Race Against Time also got massive buffs to 1 minute and 20 seconds for the minor force, so even easier to keep those up than before. No issue with this. I think this goes along with their goal to help reduce the skill gap. Orb lost a little more damage than some of the other skills did, but it's still pretty solid. Probably will be able to squeeze it in on some classes and not worth it on others. So to sum it up, there are some abilities I think ended up in a pretty good spot, but a lot of them I'm just scratching my head at where they ended up at. So much balance from the past couple of years was just thrown out the window. I'm not sure why they couldn't keep some of their past decisions in the retuning of dots rather than going with a blanket readjustment of everything. And to repeat from earlier about them saying we are going to focus on any resulting balance issues for the next few updates, not gonna lie, that kind of worries me. I don't want to deal with broken combat stuff for several patches. But we'll see what happens. That's why I'm doing this video, trying to get them some feedback. So for the last section here, I'll just cover a few other topics that I think are worth mentioning before we close this out. The trial dummy getting updated is very nice. Having a test environment that more closely resembles what a coordinated raid group would bring is really nice and much easier for players to understand, rather than the outdated one that we had before. There isn't this weird thing like it was before where you need to set up in a specific way for a dummy that didn't match to any real raid setup. I will say though, I think Elemental Catalyst should be added to this. It is a staple in pretty much all raid groups, and without it, it makes light armor wearers look a little worse than they would probably actually perform. Medium armor is already the preferable route to go with Alkosh present, so having that evened out a little bit with Elemental Catalyst also present would be a better representation for a variety of different builds overall. They did say we have tried to focus on important buffs and debuffs that we see a large majority of groups build around rather than every possible buff and debuff, but EC seems to me like it 100% fits that category that they listed. So I hope they can get that added to it as well. Next up is Rapid Strikes. I'm not sure if you guys have seen the animation, but it looks, well, I'm not gonna be mean. I'll just let you all tell me what you think about it. Kind of just looks like spamming light attacks though, which is an interesting change. I'm not really sure why they adjusted this. The skill itself though, it does seem to be overperforming. I think this is to do with it scaling with both Thaumaturge and Master at Arms, which no skill should do since those damage types directly contradict each other. So that just seems like a bug. So hopefully that can get adjusted and bring Rapid Strikes down just a little bit. Few other weird things going on as well. The dot from Carve and also Mystic Orb are not increasing in damage with the Necromancer's Rapid Rot passive. At least the tooltips don't change based on that passive having points into it or not. Also, lots of arena weapons are screwed up as well, likely to do with the changing of skills and timers. VMA dual wield doesn't work at all, and the Master's Bow and Black Rose Prison dual wield both stop early before the dots are finished. Seems most likely they are hard-coded with the old timers. So let's talk about Oakensoul real quick. My original reaction was that they took the sledgehammer to it, but after taking it into a trial on the PTS, while yes, my damage was a good 30 to 35k DPS below what I've been doing on the live servers, it seemed like everyone in the group was also experiencing very similar losses, and they were not wearing Oakensoul. So I was sitting in the same relative DPS range in my group that I normally would be. So yes, it does sting to get nerfed, but really the major heroism is the big thing that I felt the most. Definitely still seems like a viable option for group play. Now for solo, I'm sure that the hits are felt a bit more since some of the buffs that were lost are redundant for trial groups, so I can't really comment on that aspect, but it felt okay to me in group play for the limited time I got to use it. And then finally, I know there has been a bit of controversy as well with the tweet from Rich, which came out after the combat preview and before the PTS patch notes actually went live. Some of you have said this tweet has aged like milk, but I won't talk about this too long because it isn't really related to the game balance directly, but I do think it is important for the community. I'll start by saying I do genuinely think that Rich cares deeply about this game and wants it to be the best that it can be. There is passion there that I'm thankful is present in a creative director of a game that I love. I also think he struggles with receiving criticism, and this isn't the first time he's gotten flustered publicly over community complaints. Many people have also been circulating that he replied to this comment about Twitter users acting like they know more than game devs. And yeah, I'm sure game devs do get a lot of that, but you know what? That really happens in all professions, in all walks of life. It isn't a problem exclusive to game development. Sometimes people are downright terrible and take it too far, absolutely. But I do think that is the minority and that the majority of complaints come from a place of wanting to help. And at some point, I think, in any profession, if you keep running into situations where this kind of thing is happening, you have to stop viewing it as, why is everyone acting like this? And instead look within and say, what can we do better? How can we set up so that we can listen to our customers more? How can we make sure that the community feels heard and appreciated? Because calling our responses tiresome can feel like a slap in the face when many are just wanting the game to be the best that it can be. I also totally get where he's coming from as well. I'm sure it can be very frustrating to have something that you think is a win internally that the public is not perceiving that way. But I don't think posts like this do anything to help. I'd much rather see him engaging with the community by putting up polls, asking questions, stuff like, why do you guys feel this way? And engaging in conversation about making things better rather than being tired of hearing complaints. Anyways, that's all I'll say on this. I really don't mean to rag on Rich. I think he's a good dude. It's just there was a lot of talk surrounding this, so I felt like I should bring it up. And it isn't the first time that something similar to this has happened before. But if you are listening, Rich, I hope you don't take my criticism as me being against you. It's not that way at all. I'm just trying to offer some insight. I'm trying to help, always down to help however I can. This game is awesome and many others agree, and you have a lot of eyes on you and weight on your shoulders. So let us help carry some if we can. Overall, I know this was a pretty long video, but there were quite a lot of changes. And if you paid attention, it was definitely not just a bunch of complaining. Lots of good stuff in here that I am looking forward to. But I do think many of the veteran raiders in this game will reject the new timer links, as they'll find combat to be too boring. So I hope there's a better compromise there with something like third morph options like we mentioned earlier, or maybe a bit more variety where many skills are still 10 to 15 seconds, but there are enough 20 to 30 second dots that if someone wants to load up on those for an easier rotation, they would have enough of them available to do so. And then of course my biggest area of concern overall is the massive amount of damage loss going into this patch. This is not going to raise the floor. This is going to make content more difficult at all levels of gameplay, whether you're doing your first veteran Craglorn trial, trying to get your first VCR +3 clear, or going for a top-end achievement like Godslayer or Planesbreaker. Groups that are on the cusp of conquering these achievements will feel a nasty blow and have to face a lot of backtracking. And not for anything that we did, but because Zos decided that we're too strong. How can you say we have too much power when 99.9% of the people still can't complete all of the content? It would be great if we could look forward to future patches with hope that maybe the achievements will be a step closer for us instead of further out of reach. This is a constant struggle, it feels like, in ESO. We just want to play the game and have fun and get stronger as time goes on. If the top elite players are obliterating the content, well, so be it. Let them. They've earned that. If it's a PvP issue, we have Battle Spirit. Use it. Lean into it. But something has to change fundamentally that needs to be coordinated between the encounter team and the combat balance team to make things more accessible for our players, not less. Because if this patch goes through the way that it is right now, it's going to be tougher on everyone. That's going to wrap up this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already subbed, it helps out a ton. It's free, and you can always change your mind later if you're no longer interested in the content. But let me know what you guys think about what is going on right now. I do read all my comments that come through and try to expand my point of view from them. Big thanks to all of the current Patreon supporters and YouTube members. Link is in the description if you're interested in helping out that way. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougar's Bay and the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Iffy, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, Blake1816, Mordecai1212, Santanico, Nalandia, Hey It's Spork, Florian, and Vadridi. Thanks again for stopping by. I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye.